line up a few technical things. This is a new format for an online technical briefing, so.
It's going live now.
Great. All right, so hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. So we're going to be running through a technical briefing on the city's new zoning bylaw. And since we have a pretty small group of just 3 with us, just a few notes. So we are going to be live streaming this and it'll be recorded via YouTube. So if you're looking for recording after the fact, we can send that link out to you. And if you're having any issues with connecting to the session or anything like that, you can log off and rejoin using the link. This is set up as a meeting, not a webinar, so you shouldn't have any problems with that. Or you can also call in at the number on the screen or flip me an email. So we're just about 5 minutes late to start here, but we're going to have a quick presentation by city staff on the project itself. And then after that, there will be a Q&A. And we'll be joined today by Paige Agnew, Commissioner of Community Services, Laura Flaherty, so Project Manager of Planning Services, Tim Park, Acting Director, Planning Services, and then Sukriti Agarwal, Acting Manager of Policy Planning. So with that in mind, I'm just going to pass things over to Laura, who can take it away with the presentation.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for joining us today for the technical briefing on the new zoning bylaw. So as Mark's already indicated, with us we have Paige Agnew, Tim Park, Sukriti Agarwal, and myself. I'm the project manager in planning services, primarily responsible for the city's new zoning bylaw project. So Mark, next slide, please. As a quick overview of the anticipated agenda for this briefing, we will have a conversation about the strategic direction of planning services as a whole, which will be led by Ms. Agnew. I will then get into some background information about zoning bylaws and the new zoning bylaw project, followed by a description of the current discussion papers that will be the subject of public meetings tonight at Planning Committee. Following the presentation, we will open the floor for a question and answer period. Next slide. So I'll hand this off to Paige here.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We've only done one technical briefing before, so this is a newer format that we're trying out. And I thought that this would be a really effective opportunity for us to have more of a conversation with key members of the media community in Kingston to talk about what we're doing with the zoning bylaw. Zoning is one of those pieces that to the average person can be incredibly technical, boring, hard to understand, and it can be really confusing. And I think we have a history of that with respect to having 5 different zoning bylaws for the city, and that makes things incredibly hard for people. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the strategic direction and thinking specifically with respect to planning services overall, but also with the strategic direction that we've applied specifically to the creation of the city's new zoning bylaw. And we're really excited to share that with you today, as well as some of the key information leading up to the release of the draft of the second draft of this document later this summer. Have the next slide, please. So as a city, we've been on a path of a conversation about smart growth for a number of years. We've determined that we want to be a smart, livable, and the leading city. And this council in particular has made some pretty significant commitments, not only to issues of housing affordability, but also specifically around climate change and wanting to be a climate change leader provincially and nationally as well. So all of that thinking with respect to how this council has evolved in its strategic priorities have also been informing our work with respect to all of our planning policy, but also specifically with respect to what we're doing right now with the city zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So again, looking at those key strategic directives that council set at the beginning of their term, we're about 2/3, or I guess more than 2/3, 3/4 the way through the council term. And we have a lot of responsibility in planning services with respect to a number of these initiatives. And the initiatives are linked with one another. So our ability to increase housing and do that in a smart and compact way is actually inextricably linked with some of our goals on climate change, improving walkability and how people move around the city. And then also with respect to economic development opportunities, that's something that we're never losing sight on as planning services, and the ability for us to simplify the process for people, to modernize the process, and to make it easier for good development in Kingston to happen quickly. Next slide, please. I wanted to take just a couple of minutes as well. We're just launching a new resource for the community. We have a planning services page that is nestled within the Get Involved platform. And this is specifically an opportunity for residents to connect specifically with the people in planning services that are listed there on the right-hand side, the majority of us which are actually on today's session, and to be able to get more information about what we do as a planning services team. We want to the greatest extent possible, facilitate as many conversations about planning with the community. We do have a number of people that show up for planning meetings, but relative to the overall size of the population and the diversity of population we have in the city, we still have a long way to go in terms of making that much more of an inclusive conversation than what we've been able to do to date. And this is another resource we've developed to try to help in that respect. Next slide, please. Bill, you'd be familiar with this certainly because I know you watch council meetings quite closely, but over the last couple of months, we've been bringing a series of reports trying to forecast to council and the community a number of the key policy initiatives that we're undertaking for planning services. Some of them have been in development for a couple of years, and some of the major policy work that we're working on right now and will be completing this year. Oftentimes in any city, they are multi-year initiatives, and particularly in Kingston, we're trying to apply all of those lenses of thinking that I talked about before in terms of sustainability, climate change, affordability, inclusiveness, housing creation, moving around the city in a variety of modalities, not just car-oriented thinking. And that's going into all of our planning policy projects right now. But specifically, we have a number that are going to be completing this year, being the Central Kingston Growth Strategy, which has been in development for a couple of years. And this project in particular, the city's new zoning bylaw. The city has been working on the new zoning bylaw since amalgamation in 1999. So this is a very important time. It's an exciting time for the city. I think people have been long awaiting this. And initially when we inherited this version of the project, since we have a number of new people on the project team as part of the discussion today and in the leadership positions within the city's planning services department, we wanted to really make sure that the approach to the creation of the new zoning bylaw wasn't just a matter of harmonizing or putting together old zoning bylaws, but completely trying to rethink some fundamental pieces of zoning, really trying to simplify the document and remove any extraneous complicated language or descriptions, things that require complex interpretation, so that it would be a much easier user-free document for the community and for staff for that matter. And really also thinking about how to utilize this as a platform to take us where we want to go with respect to making good development in the right places easier to do and providing a roadmap to do that through really clear policy. So you're going to see those as key themes coming through the information that we're presenting to you today, and as key pieces that we're looking at as specific lenses or criteria for success upon the completion of this project to know if we've done the job that we set out to do. Next slide, please. Laura, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Paige. So obviously as a project manager in planning services who's primarily charged with the city's new zoning bylaw project, it's a great pleasure and responsibility for me. And it's certainly something that we're really excited to be able to finally bring to fruition for the city. Next slide. Sorry about that. In Ontario, when we talk about zoning bylaws, there are four main levels of legislation and policy that we need to consider. The governing legislation is first, so that's the Planning Act. And this act enables municipalities to prepare land use planning policies and regulations as long as they're consistent with the provincial policy statement. So the provincial policy statement is a document that contains high-level province-wide policies related to land use planning matters that are of provincial interest. We then move into the municipal policies, which are contained within our official plan. And these policies are meant to take the provincial wide policies and apply them in Kingston in a more specific manner that guides land use decisions and the future growth in a manner that's consistent with the PPS and that is customized to the Kingston context. Finally, we move into zoning bylaws. So zoning bylaws are specific regulations that look at properties at a more site-specific level and provide regulations about how that property can be used and developed. Zoning bylaws are required to conform with our official plan and also to be consistent with the PPS. Next slide, Mark. So what do zoning bylaws do? Zoning bylaws regulate the use of land. They regulate how large a building can be and where it can be located on a property. They regulate the street frontage, lot depth, lot area of new parcels of land. They also dictate how many parking, loading, and bicycle parking spaces need to be provided, and other performance standard elements such as landscaped open space, amenity area for residents, and so on. Zoning bylaws are used to also prohibit development in hazardous, contaminated, or environmentally sensitive areas. They're also used to establish separation distances between uses that are incompatible or have the potential to negatively impact more sensitive uses. Next slide. Just as important as what they do is basically what they don't do. So zoning bylaws do not regulate the users, the people who can live in or use a building. They don't regulate the interior building design or construction techniques of buildings. They don't dictate the design of our public streets, our parks, or other public spaces. They also aren't used to control stormwater runoff or the functional layout of properties. Zoning bylaws cannot discriminate against any person or group of people. They cannot be applied retroactively or be used to force owners to develop or redevelop their properties. They also can't override other legislation such as the Building Code or the Ontario Heritage Act. Next slide. So in Kingston, we have 5 main zoning bylaws that currently apply across the municipality. These bylaws are legacies of the former townships and predate amalgamation. 3 of the existing zoning bylaws were adopted in the 1970s, and 2 of the existing zoning bylaws were adopted in the 1990s. The patchwork of zoning that applies across the city is inconsistent, with different rules applied to different areas. The existing zoning bylaws also predate the current official plan, which was adopted in 2010. At present, there's a disconnect between the vision for future growth of the city and the provisions of the existing zoning. Next slide. When we talk about a new zoning bylaw for the city of Kingston, we have a vision to harmonize, simplify, and modernize the zoning framework across the municipality. Harmonizing zoning provisions is more than just a consolidation exercise. It means we will carry forward some of the existing zoning bylaw regulations, but it also means that new and updated regulations will be created to ensure that the zoning bylaw aligns with the vision established by the official plan. Simplifying the zoning bylaw means that the language and the maps will be modified to be as user-friendly as possible. Requirements will be clearer and more easily understood. Modernizing the zoning bylaw means that terms will be updated, uses will reflect current trends, and will be written in a way that allows for innovation for future trends and uses to thrive. Next slide. So as Paige had indicated, the new zoning bylaw has been talked about in Kingston for many, many years. What the slide you see before you kind of shows a timeline of the phases of the project that we're working on. So phase 1 of the project established this strategic direction for a new zoning bylaw and created a project direction for a future project consultant. The strategic direction was largely focused on a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws, so really carrying forward the existing provisions into one new bylaw. Phase 2 of the project was led by an outside consultant team and resulted in the creation of the first draft of a new zoning bylaw, which was released to the public in October of 2016 with extensive public consultation at that time. Following the release of the first draft, the project was put on hold so that staff resources could be directed to other policy projects that have impacts on the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. So the phase that we're currently in is phase 3, which is being led by staff and planning services. Next slide. So while the initial direction for the zoning bylaw project was more of a consolidation exercise, phase 3 of the project has expanded the scope to ensure that certain topics are given a tweak and other topics are given a rethink. So tweaking some of the requirements mean that they may be updated to better align with new policies, or that the approach has been modified in a manner that maintains the intent of the policies, but is done so in an alternate format than how they're applied today. And rethinking some of the regulations means that new modern ideas will find their way into the new zoning bylaw. It gives the opportunity to create new zoning bylaw provisions that can propel us forward towards the realization of the vision of the official plan, rather than solely being rooted in past practices. Next slide. So we are at the beginning of the public consultation phase of phase 3 of this project. In this phase, 2 special meetings of planning committee have been scheduled to hold public meetings about 4 specific topics. So 2 topics will be presented at discussion papers at each special meeting. The first meeting is scheduled for tonight, April 29th. The second meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, June 23rd. Following these public meetings, staff anticipate releasing the second draft of the new zoning bylaw to the public this summer. Public consultation on the second draft will follow this summer and fall, with statutory public meeting at planning committee in early fall, followed by a special meeting of council. After all feedback has been received on the second draft, staff will work to prepare a third and final draft, which is expected to be presented at a final statutory open house, public meeting, and to council in early 2022. Next slide. There are many ways members of the public can participate in the new zoning bylaw project. We have a project website along with a Get Involved Kingston webpage dedicated specifically to this project. Staff are also maintaining a project email list where updates are sent and when new documents are published or events are scheduled. Written comments can be sent via email or mail, and staff are available to speak on the phone or meet virtually with interested members of the public. Finally, members of the public can virtually attend future events and public meetings. Next slide. So let's talk briefly about the discussion paper topics that are the focus of tonight's public meetings, as well as a brief debut on the topics that will be the focus of the public meetings on June 23rd. Next slide. The Schools and Places of Worship discussion paper provides a foundation that would allow for schools to be treated the same regardless of their funding model, whether they're private or public schools. And it sets a high-level framework for how schools will be treated in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. The paper also introduces one of the rethink topics where staff have identified an opportunity to permit new complementary uses in places of worship, such as commercial, office, community centers, cultural and educational uses, and catering kitchens, along with permissions for additional residential units where they are located in residential zones. This is intended to support the viability of both the place of worship and the surrounding community by supplementing their principal function with additional options benefiting the community. Next slide, please. Amendments are proposed to the official plan policies in order to better implement the intent of riparian corridor protections in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. So the riparian corridors are a 30-meter buffer around water bodies and wetlands. They will be moved from a mapped zone into a text-based 30-meter setback. The intent of this is to expand underlying zoning permissions to approximately 4,200 properties in the city without creating financing or other legal non-conforming use issues on existing properties. So these amendments are expected to create enhanced environmental protections because a water body doesn't need to be specifically shown on a map to be protected. Next slide. So the final 2 discussion papers, they're not subject of tonight's public meeting, but a future public meeting on Wednesday, June 23rd, include the power of parking, a new parking paradigm for Kingston. So the discussion paper is intended to start a new public conversation about parking regulations and how they impact many important facets of our city. The paper focuses on the key strategic priorities of council and the vision of the official plan and provides options that can be employed in the new zoning bylaw to propel the city forward. These options can help to achieve many of the ambitious priorities and policies around the climate emergency, affordable housing, active transportation, and the urban design of our community. The tiny houses, shipping containers, and additional residential units discussion paper is intended to create a conversation about modernizing the language in the zoning bylaw to allow for housing trends and to allow for up to 3 residential units on many properties across the city. Next slide. So thank you for the opportunity to provide some of the background about the new zoning bylaw project. We are happy to answer any questions about the project or any questions you have about planning services as a whole.
Oh, that's a lot to take in. I want to start with, do you mind if I go ahead, or is there someone else?
No, you can go
Please
ahead.
go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk about the places of worship. Opening that up, I guess, to new and complementary uses. Can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? These are for existing places of worship, not ones that haven't been built yet, right? So give me some examples, some more examples of how this modernized bylaw would allow a church, for example, to do something different that they can't do now.
For sure. So I think the intent of the places of worship discussion paper is to identify that we acknowledge that places of worship are rather large facilities that are often outfitted with substantial kitchens and auditorium spaces where large numbers of people are able to gather. And they've been designed in a way that it minimizes the land use impacts of large gatherings on the neighborhood that they're already situated in. So we also recognize that a lot of those places of worship, the facilities are underutilized for many periods of time where they're outside of the peak place of worship using that space. So what we've identified is that there's a potential where we can allow for additional uses to utilize those spaces that already exist for places of worship. So for example, a large kitchen facility may be able to be used by a catering company or someone who's creating baked goods for sale at different places, or they may be able to have community workshops or other types of educational uses in like an auditorium space.
But like say a church has a big parking lot and they want to develop, say, a small commercial strip mall in that parking lot. This would not allow that. It's only what exists right now.
Yes,
they could use. Okay.
Exactly.
And would they be taxed on something like that?
Certainly, if they are using the place of worship for uses that aren't related to the actual religious organization, they could be subject to additional property taxes, and it's something that they would need to explore with the city's financial services department.
Okay.
Laura, if I could just add, Bill, sorry, I just wanted to jump in there for a quick sec with some additional comments. I think that one of the key things that's important about this too to acknowledge is that some of the rethink that we've done with respect to places of worship in particular has really come about because we've been listening to people in the community over the last number of years, maybe small businesses, places of worship that have had declining parishioners going there, but yet they still have ongoing significant capital costs. Some of those buildings are also potentially heritage protected. And the idea of looking for additional ways to be able to support the continuation of a place of worship, but to modernize and create opportunities even for small businesses in the community. And some of the circumstances we've been faced with as planning services, which is never a place we enjoy being, is when we have to tell that small business owner, sorry, it's not permitted in the zoning. You have to go through the process, and to go through a process of rezoning in Kingston's probably about $7,000 to $10,000 and can take 6 months. So we tried to take all of that feedback and think about it really strategically in developing the second draft and these provisions in particular that we're proposing to change.
Okay, interesting. Sorry, I just want to make sure I got all the examples there. You mentioned kitchens and commercial. Like what kind of commercial are you talking about? Like a little tax office, something in the basement of a church, or what kind? Give me some examples of what would qualify for that.
Yes, certainly. So various types of office uses that would occupy those spaces, or maybe some type of cafe or limited scale, like food service operation, but it wouldn't be anything that would be large scale or expanding beyond the extent of the existing place of worship.
Okay. Interesting. How many places of worship or churches would you say currently exist in Kingston that could benefit, or could benefit from this?
If you just
Count
give me a
them?
minute, I can get you the exact number. We have it in our discussion paper. I just don't have it off of the top of my head. So maybe move on to the next question and I'll pull up the exact number for you.
Okay. Is anyone else, me again, or? Okay. I want to talk about the schools now. You mentioned the schools. So you're going to treat private and public schools the same. Because I know in some neighborhoods there are private schools like on a corner or something like that, where obviously standard like elementary public schools are much bigger areas. So again, can you just elaborate on that so I'm clear as to why it's important that you bring these two, private and public, together in the same zoning policy?
Certainly. So in the new zoning bylaw, we're really trying to refine the uses in a way that doesn't focus on the user of the space and is a lot more focused on the land use itself. So in doing that, we acknowledge that our current official plan policies treat schools differently, whether they're publicly funded or privately funded. So when we're looking at that from a land use planning perspective, we've identified that the actual use is not impacted by whether it's publicly funded or privately funded. So right now there are some restrictions on where private schools can be located within the city, where public schools can be located in the middle of a residential neighborhood, for example, private or public elementary schools, I should say, within the middle of a neighborhood, whereas those same public elementary schools would be restricted to commercial zones or institutional zones. So when we were looking at creating the new zoning bylaw, we really wanted to focus on the use of the school and not really look at the funding model of that school, which would then enable for private schools to be opened up in the same places where their public counterparts can.
Okay. Do you have any clear examples of like how that would apply today? If any hypothetical?
Certainly. So if someone were one of the existing private schools, if they're located in a residential zone right now, if we had passed the new zoning bylaw in a way that prohibited private schools from being located within that residential zone, those uses would then become legal non-conforming uses, and they wouldn't be allowed to expand their operation or put any kind of additions or any type of changes to their property without going through an expensive planning process. So we really wanted to ensure that our as of right permissions in the zoning bylaw actually allow for those private schools to continue to operate where they are and to maybe potentially purchase a new property and move somewhere else where it's equally as important to be located as a private school.
Okay. These two subjects on the schools and places of worship, that is the focus tonight. Is that what you're saying? And then parking and those other issues come later. Is that the rollout plan?
Yes. So the schools and places of worship is the second discussion paper on tonight's public meeting. So that's all in one discussion paper. And then the other discussion paper topic for tonight is the environmental protection areas.
I see.
Paper.
Can we talk about parking then, or are we jumping the gun on that? You can?
The information isn't publicly available yet, but we certainly can jump the gun and talk about it at a high level.
Yeah.
It's a rather exciting topic and one that we've been working very hard on behind the scenes leading up to the release of the paper in early June.
Okay, please elaborate then. What would be different than what we have today?
Certainly. So we're really trying to start a discussion that's a paradigm shift from the discussion that we typically have about parking standards, which is kind of focused on the fact that people think there aren't enough parking spaces in many areas of the city. So we're really trying to shift the focus about parking to understanding its impact on a lot of our strategic priorities and policies in the city. So when we look at parking, it has a significant impact on housing affordability, has a significant impact on the city's declaration about a climate emergency and wanting to be a leader on climate emergency. And it really has an impact on the urban design and the built form of every building that is constructed in the city, because when we look at parking standards, they're really inflexible, and they're the portion of a design that developers are actually required to look at first right now, because there's a certain size and a certain drive aisle that you need to have in order to have a parking space. So basically you lay out a parking lot on your property first, and then you do the building second. So we're really trying to have a broader conversation about the impact that parking standards have on a number of the major priorities that we have in the city.
I think
So,
I could just
so you
add
would
to that.
remove those standards? Is that what you mean?
So potentially we're going to be introducing some different options. And I think, there has been, well, I don't think, I know there has been a national conversation or international conversation. As members of the media, you probably see some of the things going on in other cities, with cities removing parking standards altogether, like their requirement for them. So what we're trying to ensure going forward, and that's the beauty of using the discussion papers, where we're introducing complex topics with ideas about how we think we may want to proceed, or with some recommendations, but looking for feedback prior to moving forward with implementing those ideas. I think what we can say with confidence is that the city's approach to parking with respect to zoning in the past has been one that has really been focused on car-oriented development, 100%. So that being a critical part of how we plan our city is really dependent on the automobile. And as we continue to try to achieve our goals with respect to sustainability, climate change, GHG neutrality, some of those big pieces that this council has championed, we have to get serious about how we plan for parking to make sure we're not working at cross purposes.
Now, Paige, are you talking about specific rules for like the downtown, or a specific lot, or is this would be a blanket policy across the city where there would be no parking standard, for example, throughout the city, or just the downtown, or somewhere else?
We're definitely looking at this citywide, but we also recognize that certain areas of the city currently have different infrastructure available to them that provide alternatives to getting around outside of driving a car. So for example, my neighborhood being out further in the west end of the city, we don't have transit here. We don't have full connectivity of sidewalks. So there's a certain dependency on cars here versus other areas of the city that are highly walkable. So we're thinking about all those pieces and really trying to move our thinking with respect to parking and getting people to be much more multimodal, and ensuring that building excessive parking, which hopefully in the future we're going to require less and less of as we move towards our climate change goals, isn't also impacting the ability of great buildings to contribute to the streetscape, how people move around, how they feel connected with the street, because a building's being separated by an ocean of a big parking lot that's not connected to anything. And it's also incredibly important with respect to accessibility and safety of pedestrians, and really putting that as a primary concern versus just thinking about, building for a maximum amount of parking, which is sort of what the city's done historically, based on the fact that a lot of our zoning bylaws are from the 1970s, as Laura said, and our most recent ones are 1990s, which really isn't recent, considering we're in 2021.
So would you say there might be the same rule would apply to a 10-story building that someone wants to put downtown versus a 10-story building in the West End? Would the same parking rules apply, or would they be tailored to that site?
Obviously, it's part of the public conversation that we're starting to have, so we don't have any definite direction on the way that it's going to go, but it's certainly one of the items that we've identified is that parking standards could be regulated based on their location within the city. So there might be different standards for the downtown as there are for areas that are on the outskirts that aren't accessed by transit versus areas that are within walkable distance to the high-level transit service that we have.
Okay. All right. We've been talking a lot too about height in the downtown. And does this bylaw address that? in any way? Have you revised that, or is it the same? Like the downtown has certain parts of the downtown, for example, have a limit on height, 6 stories, 8 stories, or sky's the limit. I'm not sure. Is that part of what you've been doing now, or is that coming later? Or what?
So within the new zoning bylaw project, we aren't proposing to increase the height permissions anywhere in the city. So any kind of height increases in the future would have to be done through a sites or an area specific policy study that would probably be led by Secrety and her policy manager role. So for example, any kind of future density by design work where we might focus on certain areas of the city, that would go through a completely separate planning process. And the new zoning bylaw isn't intending to create new height permissions anywhere in the city.
Is there a reason for that?
The creation of new height permissions requires a really detailed level of study to ensure that we aren't creating adverse planning impacts. So when we're looking at a new zoning bylaw, we're looking at such a large geography of the city that it's really difficult to have the meaningful conversations that would need to happen and the meaningful dialogue and review from a technical perspective that needs to happen in order for us to make those recommendations. So it's really a larger policy project to actually look at those specific heights and have that conversation.
That sounds like another 20-year project to work on it.
Well, I would say though, we do have a few things that are underway. So the Central Kingston Growth Strategy, which we're also finishing this year, will have new zoning regulations with it. That could include new height permissions for certain properties where we've identified intensification opportunities. So I think on the height piece, and because height is such a sensitive issue in Kingston, we're trying to deal with it on like a geography by geography basis, so we can have more of that dedicated conversation based on the fact that we have over 50,000 parcels of property in the city. If we just went and started changing zoning all over the place without being able to have more of a focused conversation, it would be very difficult for us to manage at this scale of project. So it's being done through the secondary planning work that is either underway right now or will continue to roll out by geography. The next one beyond Central Kingston that we're focusing on will be for the Central Business District, which is the downtown. And that's on the plan to start in 2022, Bill.
Okay. The green ribbon, talk more about that. The 30-meter rule. I wasn't sure if I got all of that information and how that's changing. So what is in place now and how's that going to change?
So right now, the official plan has a land use designation called the Environmental Protection Area, which includes provincially significant wetlands, areas of natural and scientific interest, and water bodies. It also includes a 30-meter buffer around all of those areas as the riparian corridors or the ribbon of life. So in the first draft of the new zoning bylaw, the EPA zone was actually drafted in a way that aligns with that EPA land use designation. So right now in the existing patchwork of zoning bylaws, we don't have an EPA zone that's applied consistently across the city. So the creation of a new EPA zone in the new zoning bylaw is really new in a lot of the areas of the city because that doesn't exist today in zoning. So when we released the first draft, the EPA zone had included that 30-meter buffer around water bodies on the actual zoning maps. And in response to the first draft, we received a number of public comments back to us questioning why properties that were previously zoned residential are now within an environmental protection area zone. So we've done a lot of work and we've done a lot of thinking about the best way to implement the environmental protection in a way that doesn't minimize the extent of that environmental protection, but it enables some underlying use permissions to be applied to those properties in a manner that maintains the intent of those riparian corridors, but also doesn't limit those properties in the same way without allowing for any underlying uses. So when we actually looked at the mapping, there were 4,200 properties across the city that had this expanded EPA zone in areas where we think can be pulled back and replaced instead with a text-based setback. And that text-based setback would still require a Planning Act application if someone wanted to go closer than 30 meters to the water, but it would establish at least those underlying use permissions on that property.
Sorry, Laura, I'm just going to jump in here. I do see that there are 2 questions from Elliot at the WIG in the queue. He's having audio issues, so I'm just going to rattle those off. Then we can open it back up. They've just been in the queue for about 12 minutes, so I want to make sure that we get to them. So Elliot is wondering, can you comment about the challenges of coming up with one zoning bylaw to govern all areas of the city, given that many neighborhoods either face unique challenges or residents have different expectations depending on where they live? And then he does have a follow-up about the environmental aspect, but maybe we can address that one and then circle back, and that brings us back into what you're talking with right now.
Certainly, it's a very mammoth undertaking to create a new zoning bylaw for such a huge geography. So when it was originally scoped, it was scoped as a consolidation exercise. So the original project consultant on the project had done an exercise where they had looked at what are the existing zoning permissions of residential zones in this area and residential zones in another area of the city, and where are those similar and where are they different. So the first draft of the new zoning bylaw was an exercise of looking at those neighborhoods and seeing how we can maintain their unique zoning for those areas, so that when we create a new zoning bylaw, it doesn't wipe away the existing zoning regulations in those areas, and it continues to maintain the character. So it was certainly a mammoth undertaking, and it continues to be, but when we did that consolidation exercise, it established a good framework where we were able to create zoning regulations that we think continue to represent those neighborhoods, and even though they're unique across the city.
All right, Elliot, if you have any follow-ups, just go ahead and keep leaving them in the chat. We'll switch to a bit of a pseudo-moderated style here where I can flag those questions as they're going along. The second question is for the environmental aspect. Did you say that it was a 30-meter setback language that applied to 4,200 properties? I believe that was already addressed in your response to Bill there.
Yes.
If you have anything to clarify, I think that's everything. We can open it back up again.
I think one of the comments I wanted to add to is, with the one slide I think is really helpful that looks at whether we're harmonizing, we're tweaking, or we're rethinking. Like I said, where we first started in this and what came forward in previous leadership within, planning services, like since amalgamation, was really harmonization or consolidating. And when we say consolidate, that would have just taken the zoning bylaws that exist and put them basically into one document and look to try to make sure that it sort of made sense. But they're really initially from council, the work that was presented to them really wasn't doing any of the tweaking or the rethinking that we're doing now. So we've taken the additional time that we have had on this project because we're working on Central Kingston and we're working on density by design and some of the other policy work that we switched gears on so that could be done in advance of the new zoning bylaw to really fundamentally rethink some of those areas in green and then tweak our thinking with respect to blue. But it's safe to say that our thinking and our work with respect to the zoning bylaw will be ongoing for many years beyond what gets presented in the winter time, because we're going to be having a new official plan process starting in 2023. And as Laura talked about at the beginning, you want to make sure that your official plan and your zoning bylaw work together, they're synced together. So as new thinking comes forward with respect to the official plan for our update, which we do every 5 years, starts in 2023. Following that, or going in parallel with that, we'll be making sure that the zoning implements that new direction in the official plan. So it's just going to be an ongoing process of refinement, rethinking, tweaking on key pieces, but we needed to get something done because people have been waiting a long time. So this was the best that we could get done in this timing, and with a further commitment to continuing this process for many years to come.
So you're going to take the feedback you hear tonight and again in June, and you're going to come up with another draft of this. So this is not carved in stones, these proposals, right?
Exactly. It's really the initial conversation on these topics, and we're certainly looking for public feedback, and we're hoping to receive a lot of public feedback that can help guide the way that we actually draft the provisions that would make their way into the second draft.
Is there any one thing in this whole review process or a couple things that stand out as being so outdated they had to go, or that they had to be added because they're just too popular and too mainstream now? Like, is there anything that really jumped out? It's like, I don't even know where to begin with something like that, but is there anything that's like this is going in all 5 bylaws, this is gone?
So a lot of the residential uses in the existing zoning bylaws are actually use the word family. So they dictate what a family is from a zoning perspective. So they really look at what a housekeeping unit is and what a family is in order for a house to be considered a single family home. So in the new zoning bylaw, we're certainly removing any reference to the users and the people who are using or occupying a space. So that's a complete change from the existing zoning bylaws. And it's certainly something that is really needed in the city to have a more flexible zone that isn't focused on the users of the space. And a lot of the retail permissions and the industrial permissions in the existing zoning bylaws dictate the types of products that can be sold. So like cigar sale establishments, and dictate the type of industrial like manufacturing companies and what products that they're actually manufacturing. So a lot of the existing zoning bylaws actually have a very specific level of detail as it relates to various commercial and employment uses, where in the new zoning bylaw, we're certainly rethinking that element and coming up with broader definitions that allow for different types of services and products to be manufactured and sold, and not focusing on the products themselves, but the use in the new zoning bylaw.
Yet there are some businesses, like for example, marijuana sales, where I think councillors, both currently and past, don't want those stores too close to schools, or alcohol sales for that matter. And those are the products. So how do you get around that?
So that's certainly something that will be subject to public consultation when the second draft is released. There are certain topics that are appropriate for a zoning bylaw to consider, and there are certain topics that might be more appropriate for something like a licensing bylaw to consider, as we're looking at specific separation distances and the actual licensing of commercial operations. So that's certainly part of the conversation that we're expecting to have when the second draft is released.
And just to get back,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Bill. The one thing I wanted to say too, when you look at home occupations, for example, and rethink, something that we haven't mentioned that certainly has been like present in our mind, especially over the last 12 months, as we've been toiling away on this, through the pandemic, is thinking about how we can better utilize good, smart planning policy to help the community recover out of COVID, and also, being reflective of what has changed over the past year that required us to rethink. So looking at home occupations, people working from home, do we have old home occupation policies that would really be contrary to the way that many people have been living and working over the past year and may continue to into the future? And looking at, ways for us, as Laura said, a lot of it's about including flexibility where we can, to help with the COVID recovery where possible. So certainly that's never lost our mind. And we've been really intentional about trying to think some of those pieces through, recognizing that this policy can be either like a go or not go for people working from home, from starting new businesses, and really thinking about the end user and trying to simplify and create opportunities to make things as easy as possible.
Yeah, interesting point. I'm glad you raised that one. The other, I just want to get back to the word family. So the term single family home has been stricken from these bylaws. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, that's what you're hearing.
What is that replaced with then? What's the new phrase?
So instead of focusing on the user, it's really focused on the building type and then a residential dwelling unit within that building type. So looking at single detached house and semi-detached house, duplex, triplex, townhouse, and so on. And then actually looking at what makes up a dwelling unit within those building types. So
I see. Okay. Just wanted to be clear about that. I have probably more questions, but I have to read through this this report, and I haven't had a chance. I did find the church listings though, so you don't have to count them. I can do that. So this goes to planning for a public meeting, but no decision, right?
Correct.
And then it comes back to another public meeting in June. When does it actually go to the planning committee then? Is that in the fall?
So the second draft of the document will be released to the public this summer, and then we'll have a statutory public meeting at planning committee in early fall.
Great.
One of the things one of the things we've been trying to think about is, obviously, I think we've used the word mammoth more than once. I mean, this is a huge document. So we're really trying to be thoughtful about sort of breaking things down more into bite-sized pieces. And again, trying to figure out ways to introduce, people to different ideas that are around key planning topics that aren't to do with any specific application, but more about the philosophy of how we want to move forward as a city, and drawing people into those conversations for feedback so that it can inform our thinking. So we're certainly open to, this is newer for us with the introduction of these types of discussion papers, and we're definitely open to feedback as to whether people are going to find them helpful, or not. But we're hopeful that this is going to be a strategy that helps to bring people to the table that maybe have never participated before. And that's certainly our hope.
Sorry, Paige. I'm just recognizing that there's about 5 minutes here remaining, give or take. We do have some time to go over if we need to, but I just want to open it up, make sure that there's nothing else from any of the other people in attendance. Elliot or Jill, if you have any questions, feel free to flag them in the chat and we can address them. Otherwise, we can just open it back up. I just wanted to step back in to make sure that everyone has an opportunity. I don't see anything at this point, having said that, so we can kind of bring things back to the regular course.
Quick word on shipping containers. So we're going to see them on every corner, or how's that going to work?
So it's obviously the subject of the public meeting in June. Certainly not the intent to allow for shipping containers to be located on every corner. We just recognize that right now there's a little bit of a disconnect between the shipping container as a structure and the way that zoning bylaws define shipping containers or structures and buildings. So it's one challenge that we've obviously been faced with our existing zoning bylaws and the patchwork of definitions across the city. So we really just want to ensure that we're having a proper public conversation about how the zoning bylaw should or shouldn't be regulating shipping containers.
That's great. Thanks. I don't really have any more questions. I do want to congratulate Paige, though, on becoming a commissioner. It's been so long since we've had a meeting in person. So the last time we talked, Paige, you were the director of planning, and now you're the commissioner. So congratulations again on that.
Thanks very much. That was my commissioner dance, which now I'm realizing is on YouTube, and I'm probably going to regret it for the rest of my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for this. It's been very helpful to get your mind around this huge document. So appreciate your time again. Thank you.
And I'm just going to jump in here. If there are any follow-up questions at any point, just feel free to send me a note and I can connect you with the project team and we can try and get you those answers, obviously. Having said that, I don't see any other questions from anyone else. So maybe I'll pass it over to you, Laura and Paige, if you have any concluding remarks or anything like that you'd like to add.
There's going to be a lot of interest on parking. That paper is going to be ready for release probably about a month, right, Laura? Beginning of June, we're looking at having it out about a month in advance of the discussion about that. And we're probably most excited about that. We've worked incredibly hard on it and looking forward to being able to, we're happy to connect with you guys again once that paper is available to go through it, because it's a big paper as well, but it's really exciting and I think represents a huge step forward for the city in the way that we're approaching thinking about regulating parking.
I have nothing further to add.
Great.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you very much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
All right, all the best. Stay safe. Hopefully
Take care.
talk soon.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.